There's a classic writing tip that's given to fiction writers, to people working on a novel. Give your hero a tragic backstory, they say. Make it something terrible that happened to them, which helps make their character more noble for being good. A relatable hero needs a tragic backstory. This is why there are so many orphans in literature. The best example, to my mind, is from Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach. His parents were out shopping in London when they were killed by an angry rhinoceros who had escaped from the zoo. Poor James. So relatable. In truth, we all have had trauma in our lives. We don't all need to become orphans to know the suffering wrought by trauma. Over the past handful of years, I've been learning about the impact of trauma on our lives. I've taken workshops and attended training that talk about being trauma-informed. There are three very interesting things about all of this that I want to share. The first is that trauma lives in our bodies. It took me a while to kind of wrap my brain around this idea. As human beings, our bodies have deep wired reactions for self-protection. When presented with a threat, we have a physical, visceral, non-cognitive reaction commonly recognized as fight or flight or freeze. Psychobiology has continued to bring good research around this aspect of our complex living. And I need to emphasize here, this is trauma living in our bodies. This isn't about how you might have an old hurt that you will not forgive. The forgiveness sermon was last month. This is about experiences that become almost written into our pre-thinking reaction. Think about how during a horror movie, a scene can make you jump, even though you know it's a movie. When you cognitively know there's no actual danger, your body still reacts. Our bodies react to fear and pain without needing to wait for our cerebral cortex to think up a logical response first. When we have a significant trauma experience, the reaction can become almost coded in our brains as part of that basic reaction. Have you ever experienced another person's reaction to a situation and think to yourself, that person's reaction is not in proportion to the situation? It feels a bit like an overreaction. If you're really attentive, you might even notice when you do it. Usually, what it means is the situation is not all that's going on for the person. One possibility is that the person has a trauma experience also at play. It's a little like the story of the two arrows in Buddhism. Buddhists talk about suffering in the Four Noble Truths, and the story of the two arrows help clarify what they mean by suffering. When we experience something that hurts us, it is like we are pierced by two arrows, Buddhism says. The first arrow is the pain that occurs, the actual event that hurt us. The second arrow is our reaction to the event that adds to our pain. The Buddhists call it the first arrow pain, and the second arrow suffering. The pain is inevitable. The suffering we can work on. Trauma caused by pain and how we respond to it, the story we create about it, the defenses we build up as a reaction to it, that's all part of the suffering in this concept that the Buddhists are talking about. Trauma is rife with suffering. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Risma Menachem reveals that we can have a trauma response to anything we perceive as a threat, not only our physical safety, but what we do and say and think, care about, believe in, or yearn for. This is why people get murdered for disrespecting other folks' relatives or their favorite sports team. But here's where it begins to get very interesting. Every person's response is different because every person processes their experiences in different ways. It's not just that people have different experiences, but every person processes those experiences in unique ways. And over time, we build up protections around that trauma, defenses that keep us safe from further harm. And those defenses become ingrained in a way that is also physical and visceral, reactions that come before the cognitive brain kicks in. Our author, Rizma Menachem, is a trauma counselor and has led trainings in a breadth of communities, including public schools, domestic violence shelters, police departments, military bases, and community centers. Early in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, he shares the story behind that title. When I was a boy, he writes, I used to watch television with my grandmother. I would sit in the middle of the sofa and she would stretch out over 2 seats, resting her legs on my lap. She often felt pain in her hands, and she would ask me to rub them in mine. When I did, her fingers would relax and she'd smile. She wasn't a large woman, but her hands were surprisingly stout, with broad fingers and thick pads below each thumb. One day I asked her, Grandma, why are your hands like that? They aren't the same as mine. My grandmother turned from the television and looked at me. Boy, she said slowly, that's from picking cotton. They have been that way since long before I was your age. I started working in the fields sharecropping when I was 4. She said the cotton plant has pointed burrs in it. When you reach your hand in, the burrs rip it up. When I first started picking, my hands were all torn and bloody. When I got older, they got thicker and thicker until I could reach in and pull out the cotton without them bleeding. My grandmother died last year, the author concludes. Sometimes I can still feel her warm, thick hands in mine. And I'll repeat something I said just a moment ago ahead of this quote. Over time, we build up protections around the trauma, defenses that keep us safe from further harm. Human beings are resourceful and adaptive. We learn and grow so we can continue to function. We all experience trauma in our lives. Different people process it in different ways. We learn and adapt, and we create defenses to protect ourselves from trauma. Later in our lives, the defense mechanisms that we've built up at first that helped us can begin to get in the way. The grandmother's hands were covered in thick calluses and scar tissue that had protected her in her youth, but caused her pain in her later years. The image of having built up a wall is common. We build an emotional wall or some other type of boundary to protect ourselves, and in time, however, we find that the wall will impede our ability to connect and build new friendships. And such traits created in response to trauma can be passed down through generations. This is the second very interesting piece that I'm learning about and wanting to share with you this morning. Trauma doesn't just impact the individual experiencing the event. It can be passed down. A classic example that many might recognize is how alcoholism runs in families. There's nothing genetic about alcoholism. They've looked. It's not passed down like blue eyes or a predisposition for heart disease, but it is passed down. And it often comes with layers of trauma and defense tactics. And the name, that's a weird sentence. Okay, so what I think I was trying to write. This is a generational experience that families have. And I would expand the word generation in this case to also talk about communities. The impact of the Holocaust is another example. There are more than 100,000 Holocaust survivors still alive today, but countless Jews born after World War II carry the echo of a trauma they didn't experience firsthand. Generations of Jews are now carrying a self-protective response to a situation in which Jewish people are targeted with hate and violence. To a non-Jew, the reaction may seem like a bit of an overreaction or in some way out of proportion. Or we could recognize that it is a trauma-informed response echoing through generations, through communities. I suspect there is a part of this going on in the situation with the war between Israel and Hamas. There is more than just the story of this one particular missile or that one particular bomb on this particular day in October of 2023. It is generations of trauma and suffering for all of the people involved in this situation, leading to what may seem to an outsider like senseless violence or extreme retaliations, or like trauma response, continuing, echoing, creating new trauma. Or consider the impact of slavery and the Jim Crow segregation. Consider the near genocide of the indigenous Indians from this land. Consider the long shadow of the clergy sex abuse scandals, which were not just about the abuse, but about the covering up of that abuse. Consider the immigrant experience, especially asylum seekers fleeing violence. The trauma does not just impact the person who experienced the traumatic event. We pass the responses to trauma down the family line into the community and the culture that is created, sometimes healthfully, usually not. Usually not, because the trauma response is responding to a trauma that may or may not still be going on. It's decoupled from the actual event. We're stuck with this cycle of trying to resolve something that may not be happening anymore, or may never have actually happened to us. All we're getting is the second arrow in the Buddhist story. Do you begin to feel the heartbreak by the enormity of all of this? The impact of trauma is in everyone. Be gentle with each other, my elder asks of us. Be gentle, we are all hurting. And this brings me to the third piece that I'm so actually excited to share, that when learning about trauma, I've also learned about healing and about generational healing. I learned that trauma lives in our bodies, and I've learned to recognize the heartbreaking extent of all the trauma, the generational echo of trauma, and I've learned that that's not the end of the story. We can unlearn the defenses we've built up when they no longer serve or are no longer needed, and we can heal what we pass on to the coming generations or out into our communities. I think I've used this example before, but I grew up in an alcoholic household, and one of the defense mechanisms I learned was the language of sarcasm, keen and biting. I was good at it. During the first decade of my marriage, I had to work to unlearn that language. I had to stop myself from letting the biting remarks slip from my mouth. Healing is possible. I think of the story we heard in the reading by Rayla Matson. Rayla's son was struggling with how other people reacted to his long hair. The story reveals how Rayla helped him navigate that harm, that it not become a trauma that perpetuated, helping him avoid the second arrow of the suffering, even though the first arrow still hurt. The pain caused by the bullies was still felt, but the suffering didn't also happen. He didn't have to build a wall of protection and shame around his heritage. One of the things Rayla did that helped was to bring a photo that Rayla found of an indigenous man with long hair. The photo was a stand-in for an ancestor. Rayla's son received the gift of strength and resolve from his ancestor in that moment. Who are your ancestors? Where do you receive the strength? How are you an ancestor? Where are you sending your strength? Our ancestors do not only pass trauma and defense mechanisms down the line. We also inherit their strength, their pride, their resilience, their sadness, their fierceness, their grace. Healing is possible. The cycle of suffering can be eased, in some cases even broken. When you do your own work, you begin a new cycle and pass along a new way. Rizma Menachem shares another story in his book, this one about healing. He writes, "Mental illness runs in my grandmother's family." He says, when her sister became schizophrenic and had to be hospitalized, my grandmother willingly took in her 2 young children and raised them as her own. My other grandmother did the same thing with my aunt's 4 children. When my aunt became cocaine addicted and lost most of her ability to be a caring parent, my father's mother didn't hesitate to take over. When I witnessed both of these changes in our family, I thought it was because my grandmothers were kind, loving, and generous women. That is generally true, of course, but something else was involved, something more important. Both of my grandmothers recognized the need for someone to step in and fulfill that role. But also they both had the capacity to wholeheartedly take on that role. They didn't have to do this. I didn't realize until I was in my early 50s. Both of my grandmothers also helped to create greater room and resilience in my body and nervous system. Their actions taught me how to shoulder responsibility. No act of health and healing is ever wasted. Such actions echo and ripple out to the children, to the communities, to the generations to come. Be gentle with each other. It is not only an act of kindness, which in and of itself is a good thing. It also offers that little rest and ease. Be gentle with each other as we heal. Our world needs healing. Our own broken hearts and aching bodies are where we begin healing the world. This is the whole focus of my call as a minister. I am here to pass the blessing along, to help anyone find their healing, to share God's love, to ease the suffering of the second arrow, to create fertile ground for one more flower to take root. This is our work. We are here to be gentle with each other, to heal from the wounds of our days and days gone by, that we too may one day become ancestors our community needs in a world without end. May it be so.